3 keys on a copper ring and a rusted bottle opener Dad never took off. I felt them slide out of my palm before I'd even decided to let go. Sienna's fingers were already closed around them, pulling, the way you'd take a knife off a child, and the rain was filling the space in my hand before I could make a fist. "You're 35, Declan. Single, no kids, no mortgage. You can start again anywhere." She tucked the keys into her coat pocket like they'd always been hers. "I can't." Blake stood behind her under the veranda light, arms crossed, not saying a word. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything he was going to say 3 weeks ago in their kitchen, when the two of them decided this without me. Behind them, past the yard, the workshop sat with its roller door half up, the way Dad always left it, like the machine shed still expected him to walk back in for one more job before tea. 40 years of oil had soaked so deep into that concrete floor you could have poured 100 kettles of hot water on it and it still wouldn't come clean. My hands were the same. I looked down at them without meaning to, knuckles scarred white in 3 places, a burn scar shaped like a comma on my left thumb from an exhaust pipe back in 2011, grease worked so far into the creases it had basically become part of the skin now. Mechanic's hands. Dad's hands, near enough. "It's not personal," Sienna said, and the worst part was, I think she believed that. She had one palm resting low on her belly. Baby number 2, due in the autumn. And Blake had put half their savings and then some into a crypto scheme that had gone belly up 15 months ago, though nobody in the family had said the word crypto out loud until the bank started sending letters with red print on them. Now here they were, in the yard I grew up in, telling me the workshop and the 6 acres under it needed to go to a developer so they could keep their heads above water. Subdivide it. Turn Mom and Dad's whole life into house blocks with names like Wattle Grove Estate. "You'll land on your feet," Blake said finally, like he was doing me a favor by speaking at all. "You always do." I didn't argue. There wasn't a version of arguing that was going to work on people who'd already decided, 3 weeks ago probably, in their own kitchen, without me, that my life was the flexible one. The spare one. The one you could fold up and put away if the family needed the space. So I got in the ute. She's an old girl, my Holden, Duco gone chalky, one door a different white to the rest of her, driver's seat gone soft and cracked at the seams. My thumb found the worn patch on the steering wheel out of habit, that one spot on the rim gone dark and smooth where I always rub it when I'm trying not to say something I'll regret. I rubbed it now, all the way down the driveway, past the front gate Dad built with fencing wire and a car battery for ballast, out onto the road with the wipers barely keeping up. I didn't have anywhere to be. That's the truth of it. 35 years old and I pointed the bonnet toward the highway because it was the only direction that wasn't backward, and I just drove. Rain coming down like the whole sky had given up trying to hold itself together. Radio full of static because I was too far out for any station to reach me properly, and I didn't bother finding one. Just the wipers, and the engine, and the Uta's old heater rattling away, doing nothing much against the cold creeping in through the door seals. The Kilmore road out that way follows the creek most of its length, and I knew, everyone round Gippsland knows, that in weather like this the creek doesn't stay where it's told. Sure enough, maybe 40 minutes out, my headlights swept across water where there shouldn't have been water. A brown sheet of it, moving fast, spread right across the low crossing and halfway up the paddock either side. And sitting in the middle of it, nose down, back wheels already gone under, a car. Some old sedan, headlights still on, being bent up crooked into the rain like it was trying to signal a plane. I stopped hard enough that the tray fishtailed a bit on the wet bitumen. Sat there a second with my heart going, waiting for a door to fly open, someone to come wading out waving their arms. Nobody came out. I got out instead, into rain that felt like it had teeth, and I could see him then, through the windscreen, an old bloke, maybe 70, white hair plastered flat, hands resting on the wheel like he was simply waiting for a red light to change. Not banging on the glass. Not clawing at the door handle. Just sitting there, dead still, staring straight ahead at all that brown water climbing up his bonnet, like a man watching a kettle he had no particular interest in whether it boiled or not. I remember thinking, why isn't he moving? I remember thinking it twice, actually, once when I first saw him and once a few seconds later when I was already up to my knees in floodwater that felt like it wanted to take my legs out from under me, and he still hadn't moved, hadn't so much as turned his head toward me, a bloke waiting straight at his window in the middle of the night, in the middle of a flood, and part of me, the part that grew up on a farm hearing stories about creeks and cattle and blokes who didn't come home, understood, even before I reached the door, that whatever was happening in that car had nothing to do with the water at all. I found out who he was the next morning, and it took my breath clean away. I'd carried him up onto the Kilmore Road with my arms hooked under his, both of us shaking so hard our teeth were going like a couple of dice in a cup, and I'd got him into the cab of the ute and cranked the heater and driven us both to the little community health center at Broadford, half expecting a nurse and a blanket and that'd be the end of it. Instead, by 7 the next morning, there was a helicopter setting down in the paddock behind the health center, flattening the grass in a wide silver circle, and 2 blokes in polo shirts with a station logo stitched on the chest were asking very politely whether I was the man who'd pulled Mr. MacLeod out of the water. Mr. MacLeod, I said, like the name was a foreign coin I was turning over in my hand. Angus MacLeod. Turned out he wasn't just some old fella who'd taken a wrong turn in the rain. Turned out he owned Corrion Downs, 4,000 hectares of it, sheep and cattle both, land that had been in his family since his great-grandfather came out from Ayrshire with nothing but a trunk and a Bible and apparently a very good eye for grass. The kind of property blokes in the district talked about the way you'd talk about a church. You didn't own land like that, you were only minding it for a while. And he'd been sitting in his car in a flood, doors locked, not moving, like a man waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. I didn't get the chance to ask him about it that morning. He was pale and quiet on a gurney, oxygen mask fogging up with every breath, and one of the station hands, a broad young fella called Roy, kept thanking me over and over in a voice that cracked a bit at the edges, like he couldn't quite believe his boss was alive to be thanked for. My phone rang while I was still standing there in wet boots, watching them load Angus into the chopper. "Where are you?" "Sienna." Not a question. A demand dressed up as one. "Broadford," I said. "Broadford? What are you doing all the way out there?" A pause, and I could hear Blake's voice low in the background, asking something, and her hand half covering the receiver before she came back. "Look, it doesn't matter. Declan, I need you to swing past the solicitors on your way back. Mr. Findley's got the transfer papers ready, he just needs your signature witnessed, and then it's done, and we can all just move forward. Move forward." Like the whole thing was a car that had stalled and all it needed was a bit of a push. I didn't say anything for a second. My free hand had gone, without me telling it to, into the pocket of my jeans, the one where the workshop keys used to sit, heavy enough that I used to complain about them wearing a hole through the denim. There was nothing there now but the seam and a bit of lint, and my fingers kept patting round like they were checking a wound to see if it had actually closed over yet. "I haven't signed anything," I said. "I know you haven't, that's why I'm calling." Her voice had that particular brightness people get when they're trying to hurry you past a decision before you can look at it properly. "The bank's given us till Friday, December." "Friday." "I'm not being dramatic, that's the actual date, and if we miss it, we lose the finance and then everything Blake and I have already put down is just gone." "Already put down," I repeated. "On my share." A long breath came down the line, the kind that's meant to sound patient and mostly sounds like someone counting to 10. "On the family's share," she said. "It was never just yours, Declan, it was Mum and Dad's, and now it's all of ours, and I am asking you, as your sister, to do the sensible thing for once." I looked out across the wet paddock at the chopper lifting off, rotor wash flattening a wide silver ring in the grass, carrying away a man who by all accounts had more land than God and had apparently decided, 12 hours earlier, that none of it was worth staying alive for. And I thought about how strange it was that 2 people could be drowning in completely different ways at the very same time, in the very same rain. "I'll call you back," I said, and I hung up before she could turn the counting to 10 voice into something sharper. They kept Angus in at Broadford for observation, then moved him by road once the water dropped, And somewhere in the shuffle of it, a nurse asking who his emergency contact should be down as, Angus himself, gravel-voiced, saying put the young fella down, the one who pulled me out. I ended up staying on at Coryon Downs. Not as a guest exactly. Not as staff either. Something in between that nobody bothered naming, which suited me fine, because I didn't especially want to think too hard about what I was doing there instead of anywhere else. The homestead was the kind of place you see on the front of a real estate brochure right before the number makes your eyes water. White verandas, a row of ancient pepper trees along the drive, a shearing shed the size of an aircraft hangar, and everywhere the low murmur of an operation still going, cattle being moved, water troughs checked, Roy and two other hands going about the business of the place with the easy, unspoken competence of people who'd been doing it their whole lives. And in the middle of all that abundance, Angus MacLeod sat most mornings on the back veranda in a cardigan 2 sizes too big for him, a blanket over his knees whether it was cold or not, staring out at 4,000 hectares like none of it was actually his. You keep doing that, he said to me, the third or fourth morning, when I brought him his tea and caught myself, again, with my hand halfway into my empty pocket. Doing what? That. He nodded at my hand. Reaching for something that isn't there. I didn't have an answer that didn't sound daft out loud, so I just shrugged and put the tea down and went to head off, and that was when he said, quiet, almost to himself, I know the feeling. I stopped at the door. What feeling's that? He didn't look at me. Just kept his eyes on the paddocks, where his own cattle were grazing under his own sky, and said, the feeling of standing in the middle of everything you've got, and none of it filling the whole. Then, before I could ask him anything more, he waved a hand like he was swatting off a fly. Go on. I'm an old man talking rot. Pour us another cup. That became the shape of things, those first days, him circling close to something and then flinching off it like the subject had teeth. I'd ask, careful, the way you'd ask a spooked horse to take a lead rope, why he'd been out on the Kilmore Road at all that night, in that weather, in a car that Roy told me privately was Angus's late wife's old runabout, the one he kept in a shed and never drove, hadn't driven in years. And every time, Angus would find somewhere else to look. He'd talk about the weather. He'd talk about a ewe that had triplets that morning. Once he told me, apropos of nothing, a very long story about a dog he'd owned in 1981, and I understood, even as I was laughing along at the right places, that I was being led round the houses on purpose. It was on the 6th day that he asked me to stay on properly. We were down at the yards, him leaning on the rail rather than actually helping. Doctor's orders, he grumbled, though I got the sense he'd never have admitted needing the rail regardless, watching Roy and the others draft off a mob of steers. I've been thinking, Angus said, about what happens to all this when I'm not around to look at it anymore. You'll outlast the lot of us, where you're going, I said, meaning it kindly, and he gave a short laugh that didn't have much humor in it. I've a son, he said. Down in Melbourne. Grant. He said the name the way you'd say a word in a language you used to speak fluently and had let go rusty. Doesn't want the land. Doesn't want the work. Wants what the land's worth, which isn't the same thing at all, though try telling him that. He turned then and looked at me properly, the way he hadn't quite managed since the flood, like he was checking something in my face against something he already believed. You, on the other hand. You went into that water for a stranger. Didn't stop to weigh it up. Didn't ring anyone to ask if it was sensible. A pause. I'd like you to stay on. Run the western block with Roy. There's a cottage sits empty down past the sheds, been empty since my sister passed. It's yours, if you want it. I felt something in my chest go tight and strange, half a lift and half a kind of shame, because my very first thought, God forgive me, was of Sienna's voice on the phone, you can start again anywhere, and how odd it was to hear almost the same sentence handed to me twice within a single week, once as an eviction and once, now, as a gift. I've got a workshop, I said, which wasn't even true anymore, not really, but it came out of my mouth before I could stop it. I had a workshop. I know what you had, Angus said. Roy told me the district talk. Your sister and her husband, the block, the subdivision. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the only real anger I'd seen out of him yet, and it wasn't for himself. That's a filthy thing to do to a brother. They've got reasons, I said, and even as I said it I could hear how much it sounded like I was making Sienna's case for her, out of habit, out of 35 years of being the one who smoothed things over. Everyone's always got reasons, Angus said. Doesn't make the doing of it right. I didn't answer that. I was still turning over his offer, the cottage, the western block, for 1,000 hectares that had nothing at all to do with me 12 days ago, and underneath all of it a small, cold voice asking whether taking any of it meant I was agreeing that Sienna had been right about me all along, that I was the flexible one, the spare one, a man you could relocate to any patch of dirt going and he'd take root soon enough, no harm done. I'll think on it, I said, which was the same thing I always said to things that frightened me. That evening the phone rang in the homestead kitchen while I was drying dishes, and Angus took it in the hallway, low voice, and I wasn't trying to listen, folks, I want to be clear about that, but old timber houses carry sound the way water carries a shout across a paddock, and I heard enough. No, Grant, I haven't signed anything yet. A silence, while the other end talked. Because it's not that simple, it was never going to be that simple, this is 4 generations of, another silence, longer. You'll do what with the West paddock? Christ, listen to yourself. And then, very quiet, in a voice I hadn't heard him use before, not weary like an old man but wounded like a much younger one, when were you going to tell me about the home you'd already picked out for me, or was I meant to find that out from the real estate agent as well? I stood in that kitchen with a tea towel bun still in my hands, and I thought about Sienna's voice down the phone that morning at Broadford, hurrying me toward Findlay's office and a signature, and I thought, with a cold little drop in my stomach, that I had just heard the exact same conversation twice in 1 week, word for word almost, in 2 kitchens 400 kilometers apart, from 2 children who were meant to love the man they were talking to. What I still didn't understand, what nobody had told me yet, and what Angus clearly wasn't ready to say out loud even to his own son, was why, on the night his boy had rung him with all that, Angus MacLeod had got into his dead wife's car and driven it straight into a flood he had to have known was there. He told me 9 days after the flood, and it rained again that night, proper rain, the kind that drums so hard on a tin roof you have to raise your voice to be heard under it, and I think that was no accident. I think he'd been waiting for the sound of it to come back. We were sitting on the back veranda, him in the same cardigan, me with a stubby I wasn't really drinking, and the security light kept flicking on and off over the yard every time a possum ran along the fence line. Angus had gone quiet in a different way than usual, not dodging, just gathering himself, the way a man does before he lifts something heavy. Margaret's car, he said, out of nowhere. The one you pulled me out of. I hadn't started her in 3 years. I wondered about that. I went out to the shed that night because Grant had just told me, over the phone, that he'd already had a chat to a real estate fella about the homestead. Already. Before he'd said one word to me about a nursing home, about selling the run, about any of it, he'd had a chat to an agent. He turned the stubby holder in his hands, round and round, not drinking from it either. 4 generations, Declan. My great-grandfather walked this land before there was a fence on it. And my own boy rang an agent before he rang his own father. I didn't say anything. I'd learned, those 9 days, that Angus talked best when nobody rushed him. I got in that car because it still smelled like her, he said. Margaret's. 10 years gone and I could still catch a bit of her perfume in the seats, if I sat there long enough with the windows up. And I thought, I'm an old fool, I know how this sounds, I thought, well, there's nothing left here that anyone wants. Not the land, not me. Grant wants the money and not the man. So I drove. Didn't have a plan, understand. Didn't tell myself I was ending anything. Just drove, the way a man walks out of a room he can't stand being in anymore, and the Kilmore Road was the road, and the water was the water, and somewhere in amongst all that I stopped much caring which way it went. The security light clicked off. Neither of us moved to fix it. I sat there with the water coming up, he said, and do you know, I felt almost peaceful about it. Isn't that a terrible thing to admit to a younger man? I felt peaceful, because I thought, nobody's going to grieve this the way you'd grieve a man who mattered. They'll grieve the estate. The paperwork. Not me. He looked over at me then, properly, the way he had that day at the yards. And then I saw headlights, and a young bloke I'd never laid eyes on in my life came off that road into that water like he hadn't got a single thing to lose either, and I thought, well, there's a stranger going under for me. When my own flesh and blood wouldn't cross the room. I felt my throat go tight, and I didn't trust myself to say much, so I said the true thing, plain. I didn't think about it, Angus. I just went. I know, he said. That's exactly it. We sat with the rain a while after that. I won't pretend it fixed anything neat and quick. Angus still wore the oversized cardigan. Still sat on the veranda some mornings like a man watching his own life from a distance. But something in him had come up for air that night, talking, and I could see it in the way he held his stubby afterward, not turning it round and round anymore, just holding it, still, the way you hold something when your hands have finally stopped shaking. He's still my son, Angus said eventually, quiet. I haven't the first idea what to do about that. But you I can do something about. Sienna rang again 2 days later. I'd half expected it, the way you expect the second wave after the first one's knocked you down. Word travels fast in farming districts, faster still once a chopper's involved, and I suppose someone at Broadford had mentioned to someone who knew someone that the bloke who'd pulled Angus MacLeod out of the flood was a young mechanic from down south whose own family had just turned him out of the family workshop. Declan. Her voice had a different color to it this time, careful, testing, like she was walking on a floor she wasn't sure would hold her weight. I heard about everything. Are you all right? God, when I think about you out there in that water, I'm fine, Sienna. I've been meaning to call. Things have just been hectic with the baby, and Blake's been under so much pressure with the, did you sign the subdivision papers yet? I said, because I wasn't in the mood, that day, to sit through the part where she made it about her. A pause. Not yet. We're still waiting on your signature. Actually, that's part of why you're not getting it. I said it the way you'd state the time, or the weather. Not raised. Not triumphant. Just a fact laid down between us, the way Angus had laid his facts down to me on the veranda, plain and without dressing. Declan, be reasonable, we talked about this, the bank's given us until, I know what the bank's giving you until. That's yours to sort out with Blake, and with whoever you go to next, but it isn't mine to fix anymore. You made that pretty clear the night you took the keys out of my hand in the rain and told me I could start again anywhere. I could hear her drawing breath to argue, and I kept going, steady, not unkind, just done. You were right, as it happens. I have started again. Just not anywhere you'd have picked for me. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've got a job now. And somewhere to live. And none of it came from you. I let that sit a second. I'm not ringing to have a go, Sienna. I'm ringing to tell you I'm not signing, and that's the end of the conversation, this time. She didn't have a comeback ready, I think, for the first time since we were kids, she genuinely didn't, and after a silence that went on a beat too long, she said, quietly, I hope it works out. Whatever it is. Not an apology. Not really. But it was the first thing she'd said to me in a fortnight that wasn't a request. Yeah, I said. Me too. And I hung up without any heat in it at all, which surprised me more than anything else that whole strange month had managed to. Angus found me out by the machinery shed that afternoon, elbow deep in the guts of an old tractor engine that hadn't turned over since the previous spring, because it turned out the western block ran 2 ancient Fergusons that Roy had long since given up wrestling with, and my hands, it seemed, hadn't forgotten what they were for. Roy tells me you've had that thing running like a sewing machine, Angus said, leaning on the shed doorframe. Just needed someone to actually look at her properly, I said, not looking up, wiping a smear of grease off my knuckles with a rag that was doing very little good. Story of my life at the minute, he said, and I caught the corner of his mouth twitch, the closest thing to a proper joke I'd heard out of him yet. He waited until I'd wiped my hands and straightened up before he did it, reached into the pocket of that oversized cardigan and pulled out a ring of keys, heavier than the one I'd lost, the metal darker, older, worn to a shine at the edges by hands that had held them a great deal longer than my father ever held his. "These open the western cottage," he said, "the machinery shed, the gate onto the river paddock, and the office in the homestead, for whenever you need the books." He didn't hand them over with any ceremony. Just held them out, the way you'd pass someone a tool they'd asked for. "I'm not offering you charity, understand? Roy can't run that block alone forever, and I'd trust you with it before I'd trust half the men round here I've known 30 years. I reached out and took them, and the weight of them settled into my palm, cool and solid, and without thinking about it, the way you don't think about breathing, my other hand went to my pocket. The old habit. 9 days of patting at an emptiness that had been sitting there since a wet night in the yard back home. Except this time my fingers found something. The new set, already slid down deep into the denim where the old ones used to ride, heavy enough to swing a little against my leg when I walked. I stood there a second with my hand still in my pocket, not patting round anymore. Just resting there, against the shape of them, the way you'd rest a hand on something you finally trusted wouldn't be taken off you in the night. "Thank you," I said, and it came out rougher than I meant it to. "Don't thank me," Angus said, already turning back toward the house, the rain starting up again soft on the tin roof behind him. "Just don't leave that gate open on the river paddock. Last fella who worked for me did that, and I lost 40 head of cattle into the next property before Christmas." I laughed, properly, for what might have been the first time in a month, and I stood there in the shed doorway a while after he'd gone, my hand still in my pocket, the rain coming down easy now instead of hard, and for once in a long while I wasn't reaching for anything that wasn't already there. It's been the better part of a year now, and I still catch myself doing it, hand going to that pocket without me telling it to, some old muscle memory from a night in the rain that I don't suppose will ever fully wear off. Except these days it's not an empty seam and a bit of lint waiting for me. It's the MacLeod set, got a bit warmer and darker at the edges now from my own hands instead of Angus's, jangling against my leg when I walk the fence line with Roy of a morning. Sienna rang again around Christmas. Not about the land, that ship, and the block, and whatever Blake's found himself doing since, sailed on without me a while back, and from what I hear they've made their peace with it in whatever way people do. She rang just to talk, the way sisters are meant to ring, and there was an ease in it I hadn't expected, no request tucked underneath, no favor waiting at the end of the sentence. I don't know if that's forgiveness exactly. I think it's closer to two people finally standing on separate ground and finding, from a distance, they can be civil about the view. Angus still won't say much more about that night than he told me on the veranda, and I've stopped pushing him for it. Some Sundays he drives out to the west block in the Uta I've since half rebuilt for him, just to sit on the tailgate and watch the cattle, and once, without any particular reason, he told me the western paddock gate sticks a bit in the cold, same as it did the year Margaret was alive, and he said it like a man passing on something worth keeping, not fixing. Grant hasn't come up to Coryon Downs. Not once, not for a birthday, not for anything. But the spare room in the homestead still has a bed made up in it, sheets changed every fortnight by Angus himself, and neither of us has ever mentioned it out loud. Most evenings now I lock up the machinery shed myself, run my thumb along the worn groove on the steering wheel of my own Uta the way I always did, out of the same old habit, and then I reach into my pocket, not checking for something missing anymore, just feeling the weight settle where it's meant to be, cool and solid against my leg, the whole way home.